You're listening to Season 7 of the podcast, Belonging to Blackness. I'm your host, Dr. India. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, Belonging to Blackness. I'm honored to welcome a truly remarkable guest, Dr. Lisa Woolfork, the founder of Black Women Stitch and fellow podcaster of the award-winning podcast, Stitch Please. Lisa is a sixth-generation sewing enthusiast, and what began as a personal, familial, and even ancestral passion for needlecraft has become a powerful movement carried forward through her work as an artist, academic, activist, and community builder. As an associate professor of English specializing in African American literature and culture, Lisa brings a deeply thoughtful and critical lens to her art. Her teaching and research explore Black women writers, Black identity, trauma, theory, and American slavery, topics seen as undergirding and inspiring her founding of Black Women Stitch in 2018. Her podcast, Stitch Please, is a bi-weekly series that centers Black creativity in fiber arts, quilting, costume design, and fashion, and has earned top podcast industry honors from Tink Media, the Ambies, Sonic Boom, Signal Awards, and Black Podcasting Awards, just to name a few. Today, we're diving deep into Lisa's personal and professional journey and why Black Women Stitch and Stitch Please are critical sites for Black voice, advocacy, and liberation. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. Thank you so much to your audience and community for having me. Congratulations to you on your show and the thriving that your show has received in terms of industry recognition as well, and for always centering and loving Black people out loud. I think that this is such a gift for us and a reminder of what our fullness can look like.
I appreciate that very much. I'm excited to get into it. I know our audience is, and looking forward to you sharing your journey. So are you ready?
I am ready.
Let's get into this.
Give Black Alliance is proud to support the podcast Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, hosted by India Lork Wilmot. The podcast is an exploration of all aspects of our Black communities, including gifts of time, talent, and treasure, while shedding a positive light on the African descendant experience globally. The Give Black Alliance informs, reforms, and transforms philanthropy to acknowledge and partner with our communities in order to bring about equitable change for all. To learn more about Give Black Alliance, visit us at giveblackalliance.org.
Act 1, Call to Adventure. So, Lisa, I've always remarked that much of what inspires us, gives us purpose, is actually autobiographically rooted. So you come from a lineage of sewists. Tell us what it means to you to be a sixth generation sewist, and what are some of your earliest memories of sewing?
I discovered that I was a sixth generation sewist thanks to some generous work of distant cousins. I grew up in a house where sewing was kind of everywhere. My mother, who was an elementary school teacher, she loved to sew because she had the summers off. She would sew clothes for us in the summertime for us to have for school year. I'm the oldest of three girls. And this was something that she just enjoyed. She liked having us all matching. She would make little cute short sets, Easter dresses, casual things for the summer, as well as more formal things for church or for school. I remember a lot of having to stand still and maybe get poked with pins if you didn't stand still, or even if you did. And it was just a beautiful time. She and her cousin would set up a couple sewing machines. We'd be running in and out of the house and playing and doing all kinds of stuff. And they would just be sewing and stitching. My grandmother and her would also do something similar. They'd bring the two machines together and, okay, let's work on the stuff for the girls for, these little halter tops and short sets that I want to make them. Or I want to make sure they have these cute little sundresses when we go to the theme park. Or, she also did other things like she macrame and she did ceramics and she did cake decorating. My mother is still a very creative person and such an important, vital influence in my own creativity. At the same time, I wanted nothing to do with it. I was a kid of the 80s. And in the 80s, you might recall, to be a teenager in the 80s was to be throttled by capitalism in the form of brand names plastered over everything, giant shirts that had Gap on it, or Gerbeau jeans, or the little Guess triangle. It was so much about hyper consumerism as part of what it meant to be cool and look cool. Members only jackets, all of that stuff. And it became very much not cool to have stuff that your mother made. In order to fit in or to be fashion forward, you were buying things from department stores or even sometimes catalogs. It was all of these different modalities of self-expressions that as like a young teenager, in the height of what I learned later was a pretty crappy economic time and situation for Black folks, with Reaganomics, cuts of social services, etc. So it's interesting that I really wanted nothing to do with it until I went to graduate school.
Okay.
It took me that long to realize that sewing your own clothes, cooking your own food was not only not antithetical to feminism. I was like, oh, I don't want to cook. I don't want to clean. I don't want to sew. These domestic arts are just shackles on the chains of oppression for women. And then I was like, wait a second, though. If you can make your own clothes, you really don't have to answer to anyone. If you can outfit your life, be it from cooking, making your own clothes, knitting your own sweaters, there is something to be said about being a pot that can sit on its own bottom, and to have that kind of self sufficiency. I started sewing in graduate school because I needed a hobby. I was overwhelmed and stressed by the prospect of a dissertation. I was in an environment that was aggressively white. My graduate school was a Big Ten university, which had 40,000 students, and less than 4% of those were non white. That is a 96% white student population. And it was an isolating time beyond the friends and colleagues that you might make in your department. For me, sewing became something that I could do, and it allowed me to transform a flat object, a piece of fabric, into something that was three-dimensional, something I could wear. It felt really powerful. It felt meaningful. And when writing felt difficult, sewing stepped in to say, you know what, you are good at a thing. In the same way that you can take this inert material, you can write this dissertation and you can write the scholarly articles and you can do these things. Let's just give your brain a chance to take maybe a little bit of a rest, and then you can go back to it. It really helped me to kind of fall in love with the process and to see and think about that process as another way of what it meant to create meaning. That's what sewing has summarily brought to me over the years. And since sewing and my graduate education kind of went together, I was learning about sewing and growing in that as I was growing in my own field and my own discipline.
I think what's interesting is, how you were able to lean back into something that was so familiar and something that you may have casted aside and leaned into it as just like, oh, this is still a part of me. Those experiences have in many ways shaped your understanding around craft and culture and even identity, even at points that you may not have had the language or the lexicon to frame it as such.
Yes.
But what compelled you to integrate sewing, as you said, often characterized as a domestic art,
Yes.
into your academic and activist life around Black liberation and intergenerational memory and radical community care, because that's also a transition in and of itself.
Absolutely, yes. I think that you have put it really beautifully. I feel like I'm someone who has had a lost and found relationship to sewing. I don't think I would ever call it a love-hate relationship because I don't recall ever hating it. But it was not something when I was a kid that I recognized as something that I really, really wanted to do. I didn't develop a passion around it as a kid. There were some things that we did. I would, sew little doll clothes that looked absolutely awful. So I didn't have that aptitude, though I did have a mild interest. It wasn't until I think I needed it. Sewing kind of found me when I needed it. And I think that starting it in grad school as an important transition into a professional career, I sewed for maybe about 17 years in my new context. I'd left and graduated and came to my current location. And sewing on the weekends, sewing at night. It was always wonderful to have a holiday break or a week-long break for spring break. I would spend that entire time sewing. If I happened to have like 30 minutes or a couple of hours, I would make something for the kids or for my spouse or something like that. And the politicization of my sewing, I think that everything is political. The way that we live in the world is the result of politics. And I think either someone has to be deliberately obtuse
Mm,
or just a liar to say that I don't believe in politics. It's like you don't have to believe in politics because politics is already believing in you. Politics is already using you. You're already in it. Nobody can opt out of it. That's like saying, I don't want to breathe the air. It's like the rest of you breathe on the planet. You don't get to opt out of that. But it was the result specifically of my organizing as a Black Lives Matter organizer of 2017 here in Charlottesville, Virginia, where we had an incursion of white supremacist activity. There was a white supremacist rally in May of 2017. There was a smaller one in June. Then the Klan came to town in July. And then in August, it was the largest white supremacist gathering on American soil in modern history. And that was in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, allegedly in response to us choosing to no longer display our Civil War participation trophies, Confederate statues, as they like to call them. We had agreed to remove them. And then so all the Klan, Nazis, all of the really violent different white supremacist organizations convened. They marched on campus with torches. They attacked students and community members on Friday night. On Saturday, a white supremacist drove his car down a street in a downtown pedestrian section and murdered a woman named Heather Heyer with his car. And I was standing at that intersection when the car came through and this young woman was killed. It was a really awful time. It was very explosive in terms of national and international attention that this attack received. There was a lot of comments on it from a variety of places, including rather enabling remarks, I thought, from the White House. I thought, okay, this is terrible. This is just awful. Fine. We keep going. We put one foot in front of the other. We still believe our lives matter. And the reason that I became involved at all was because I was outraged that white supremacists were marching on my community. I was outraged that I would have to tell my grandmother, who was born in 1913, that the Klan came to town,
mm,
you know, and the idea that these people still get to operate with such impunity under the same guise of racist terrorism. So you stand up, you resist, you say no. After I survived that event, I went to a quilt retreat. This was a retreat that I had attended for about 10 years or
mm,
so. There are folks that I had known. I was always the only Black person. I was almost always the youngest person, even though I wasn't that young. But it was a lot of much older white women who tended to be Southern and very conservative. The organizer of that event had apparently made a rule that Charlottesville was not to be discussed. I wasn't aware of this I was ultimately told about it, but felt like rather attacked. I was like, but I'm not coming here to talk about what happened to me. People were asking, they were like, oh my gosh, we heard you were there. This is really awful. My church is praying for you, et cetera, et cetera. But the organizer was very nasty to me the entire time. She didn't talk to me. I said goodbye to her at the end. She just looked and rolled her eyes and walked away. End of that event. A few weeks later, I opened my mailbox and I retrieved an envelope. And when I open the envelope, it is a check that I have written to pay for the next event. So there was an event that I had paid for and they returned the check. So my thought was maybe this event has been canceled. Let me call this one person that I know to see if this event has been canceled. And it turned out, India, the event had not been canceled.
They didn't want you there.
I had been canceled.
Mm.
And I asked, this seems really racist. What's happening? And they were like, well, I don't think she's prejudiced. I just think you broke the rule. The rule was that Charlottesville was not to be discussed, and you discussed it. Now, again, I was answering questions that people asked me. I had no intention of going in there and preaching to these people who had never shown themselves to be peers in this way. We were just people that got together and quilted and liked it and sewed, and that's what we did.
Mm.
It really shocked me. I can tell you this, surviving that white supremacist terror attack, being there and almost being killed, I never cried one tear about it. I was mostly shocked. When I got rejected from that retreat and those people gave me my check back, I was crushed.
Interesting.
I was so sad. I felt like I had lost something. I felt like it was adding insult to injury. And then I got embarrassed. And I said, who did they think I was this whole time?
Mm.
Was I the Black friend that they told everybody they had
Mm.
after they said some racist nonsense? Was I the Black person that they used to illustrate their own inclusiveness when in fact they were not? They don't have Black friends. They
Mm.
don't have peer relationships with Black people, relationships where a Black person is in authority over them, where the Black person knows more. The Black person should be deferred to. The Black person is the leader. They will talk you to death about the mission trips they take to the darker parts of the world. They will talk about that till they are green in the face. Ask them to name 3 Black people who they consider their influences, the
Mm.
people they admire and look up to, and who mentor them. They don't have those.
Mm. One of the things I wanted to come back to from something that you said earlier, and it got me thinking as you're sort of pontificating in this space about being the sole Black person in these white spaces, is the ways in which, for a lot of our African descended communities globally, we rely on fabric arts and other mediums as a way of sort of expressing and articulating something that's germane to us in terms of our personal as well as our cultural or group or ethnic identity, depending on where we are. And so for you to find yourself in a space where you're like, I entered the space as Lisa,
Yes.
right? We're having a resonant experience around sewing, around things that we may have considered as domestic arts or
Yes.
what have you, that your presence in and of itself is just always politicized, whether they are articulating it or not. The rejection of, well, we don't need you to be in our space because we allowed it until it felt threatening.
Yes.
Whereas for you, you're like, there was harm done. There was trauma and violence. There was domestic terrorism. How can I not show up in a space and not talk about this, particularly if I'm asked? For them to shut you down, it's like, so this space where we're communing together and this is community really isn't community for me.
No, it is provisional, provided that you behave in such a way that doesn't disturb or disrupt or ruffle feathers. And I think that I've heard it described this way, and I'm sure you have as well, to go from pet to threat.
Mm.
And that this happens to Black women a lot. You can be the favorite Negro for one season, and the next thing you know, you're out of there. What it taught me and what settled to me finally was I would no longer audition my humanity
Mm.
in exchange for doing something I loved. And that has been my key from that day forward. Never again. It helped me also to go back to my own stitching roots. My grandmother sewed and my mother sewed. Actually, both grandmothers sewed. I later learned that my grandmother, who passed when I was a little girl, also sewed. And they had a whole sewing club, her and her friends, so that they could work on baseball uniforms for the kids to have to play baseball, for my father and my uncles to play baseball. Both of my grandmothers had the power and the creativity of the needle as something that they could use to enhance their own lives and the lives of their family.
Mm.
That also felt very affirming at a time when I desperately needed to be affirmed. Creating Black Women Stitch was essentially helping me to build the healing I needed. Creating a Black space. At first, I started thinking about an activist sewing space. We get activists together. Activists, they are aware about all the isms, and we've done all this unlearning, and then we do these trainings. And then I was like, Lisa, you have been in meetings with lots of other activists, and that is not always fun. Instead, I'm going to do Black women. Essentially, that's how it began. And I called it Black Women Stitch because I wanted it to be clear that it was Black and that it was women. I know some people like girls, etc., but I don't use the word girl in a formal context when I'm talking about adults. And so it was important to me that women meant women, and that's expansive: queer women, trans women, women, very large category for me. And then stitching started with just sewing and apparel sewing, but it also includes a lot of quilting. We're branching out into crochet and knitting. I've interviewed crochet artists and knitters, as well as those who do needlepoint and cross stitch and tatting and tufting and all of these other amazing fiber arts. It feels like what I'm trying to create, India, is
Mm.
that living room on a Saturday after we've cleaned the house that morning, or my mother would have us clean the house Friday night so that we could have a full Saturday. After we did some errands, come home, there's lunch, there's sewing, the machines are set up, the fabric is out. Come here, let me measure your chest. Wait, stop. Let me get your hips right here. Stop moving. And the radio is playing, soul music. There's something cooking on the stove. People got their cans of Pepsi and Coca-Cola or whatever. It was what the heart of family feels like.
Mm.
If I had to describe it without words, it would be that image.
I think in many ways that even just having a space in and of itself is a form of collective resistance, because I think oftentimes the craft itself is often erased and or even marginalized. I mean, you even talked about your own marginalization being in that other group, being the only
Yeah,
one. But here, if
yeah.
you're with other Black women, it's not just performative. We're demonstrating and basking in dignity and in joy, right? The things that are the glue that holds us together in general anyway. And that our grandmothers and foremothers have always engaged in for survival, right? So they may have stitched for need, but here this is a need, but in a different way. Like, yeah, can we still go to the store and buy clothes? Of course, but this is a different kind of need.
My mother tells me stories that she remembers. This is just one generation away, that as a Black kid, she could not try on shoes at the shoe store. There was a lot of Black folks who could not try on clothes at the department stores they were buying clothes from. For some folks, sewing your own clothes, making something really beautiful was another way to not just preserve your dignity, you could exercise some wonderful creativity and creative freedom that way as well. So I think that's why we get these amazing church hats and the milliners that do that
Right.
kind of stuff. I just think that people don't remember these things, like going into a dressing room and just changing clothes and doing whatever. That was not always a thing Black people could do in this country. But you could, if you had the skills and the talent, you could make something that they didn't want you to have.
I have to share something that's genuinely changed my sleep. I love my Cozy Earth bamboo sheets. They're unbelievably soft, breathable, and feel like luxury every single night. Treat yourself by using my 21% off discount code, which is Belong to Black at cozyearth.com. And know that we earn a commission when you use our code. So when you buy, you're also supporting the podcast. Find my discount code in the episode description and get luxurious sleep your body will appreciate. I know mine does. Act 2, The Road. So, Lisa, at this juncture, I always like to ask this question, and I'm always curious and excited just to hear what my guests say in response. How do you play?
It is such a good question. I love it because, of course, sewing is the thing. I love sewing. I love fabric shopping. And again, I will just go ahead and acknowledge sewing, buying fabric, two different hobbies. I think I do love sewing more than I love buying fabric. My family would disagree. They're like, you have way more fabric than things that you have sewn. And I'm like, you don't know that for sure. But in terms of play, I definitely do play while sewing. I think that it is a great form of active rest for me. It feels restorative to make things. If I want something a bit less active, I watch a lot of K dramas because I can suspend so much disbelief and just watch this cute little, very formulaic story that will always work out in the end. I also, when I was in Boston for my sabbatical, got very much into building miniatures. And so there are these little kits that you can buy that have 600 half-inch by half-inch squares that are also books. Take this half-inch sticker and wrap it for 200 little tiny books. And I did that, and then you put them on shelves with the tweezers. That's another thing that's been really fun for me, building those little things. So those are the hobbies that I do beyond the sewing and making quilts and apparel. But the sewing keeps me quite busy. And it does bring me a lot of joy. And I feel like whether I'm making something or if I'm considering making something, sewing does really put a smile on my face. And so when I travel, for example, I'm buying fabric from those places because that fabric is the souvenir. So when someone says, "Oh my gosh, I love that fabric," or "I love that outfit," it's like, "Oh, I got this fabric in Paris," or "I got this fabric in Cape Town," or "I got this fabric in New York," or "I got this fabric in LA." I do like the idea of sewing as a thing that I've been using for so much of my life as a way to create meaning and clothes.
I love that. So, talk to us a bit about the podcast Stitch Please. We've already discussed this to some extent around the dominant imagery and the narratives about crafting communities will often center white creatives, as you've also experienced for yourself. What was the vision behind creating a platform that centered Black sewists and quilters and designers and artists, particularly using sound and video to do this outside of having Black Women Stitch, which is an actual space in person?
The reason that the podcast came about was because of the very first event that I held as Black Women Stitch. I held a small retreat, 10 or 11 women came. I had a very detailed intake form. I was someone who was clearly looking for healing. And I did believe very strongly and still do that, in the words of Dr. Joy Harden Bradford, sisterhood heals. And that's what it was like for me. My youngest sister, she was the one that actually pushed me. She is not like me at all. We're all wonderful in different ways. As when she learned that I would gotten put out of that white people's retreat, she said, "You know what I would do? I would go and have my own thing right next door to them. And I would go out there every day and I'd be like, screw you." I wouldn't let them stop me. Absolutely not. And so essentially that is what I did. We did not go out on the porch. We weren't next door to anyone that we had to make rude hand gestures for, but it was really about creating what I needed. And so I cultivated this beautiful, very first retreat. It was really wonderful. It was at the beach. It was really idyllic. It was just what I needed. And because it was us, India,
Mm,
it felt so different.
mm,
Felt like slipping into some comfortable slippers that are waiting for you at the end of a long day. It was like sliding into a nice warm tub. It was so affirming. People were really excited. They were grateful for what I had done. None of them had had any experiences surviving racial terror as I had, but they all were Black women who knew what it was like to live in white America. And they had all faced some sort of racism and
mm,
also appreciated having a centered sewing space that was just for us. That environment, the conversations, I mean, it was things like every day we had a different DJ. The person who was the DJ was the person that cooked dinner, and you get to control the music for the day. Everybody's music was great. New Orleans bounce. I learned about that. I learned about go-go music from friends who love go-go. There was a lot of dance hall reggae, which I absolutely love. There was soul music. But at one point, I think Erica Badu or somebody was on. And when I tell you to a woman, each of us are sewing our things, stitching our hems, cutting out our fabrics, lining up the bra straps for the corsets, whatever. We are all singing along.
mm.
It's just the hum of the sewing machine, sound of the ocean outside, sunlight beaming in from all angles, and a group of Black women humming and stitching and just glad to be there and to be with each other. And that to me was so healing
Mm,
that I wanted to take some of those conversations, talking about life, talking about work, talking about foolishness, but also talking about, okay, when do you do this stitch versus this stitch? Okay, this is why understitching is important. And when I understitch, they recommend a single stitch, but I prefer to use a triple zigzag. And let me tell you why. But where did you find that dress pattern? Okay, can you tell me more about that? Oh, you have extra that fabric? Okay, thanks. I think I'll take some of that, but let me trade you for this. Have you thought about this pattern for this problem? Audre Lorde described this in one of her biographical essays as Blackfulness.
mm,
Talking about, I think, Antigua, she loved how blackful it was.
mm.
And this was a blackful space. It felt like love.
Wow.
I wanted to take that love, that affirming, that, oh my gosh, I didn't know I needed this. I didn't know this was possible. That to me felt so needed. And it really helped me to heal. And it helped me to say, I want to center and celebrate us so that nobody has to go wondering if we are out there. No one has to wonder, is there somebody who is interested in the same things that they are? We had that event in March. I applied for a grant in June. It was an artist grant, and I applied for it to host two sewing pop ups. And we had 40 people come. 20 were able to get a scholarship thanks to the funding I won from that grant. And then the rest of the money, I bought podcast equipment. Very simple. I bought a microphone, I bought an audio interface, I subscribed to a hosting site for a year. And then I think I watched a bunch of videos on YouTube. Then I had a podcast. And it was motivated by that. Here we are now, over 300 episodes later, more than 7 years later, still going, still stitching, and I still have people to talk to. So that's
I love that you didn't need to have to audition your humanity, as you mentioned earlier. This was something for you where you're like, no, I am Blackful. I'm thankful in this space. And we're celebrated just because. And now you have this podcast that has resonated with so many of the folks too, that it's received numerous podcast industry awards and been featured in major publications. How do you think the experience of the podcast has impacted your thinking about the art and practice of sewing and the role of storytelling? Because, in effect, you are creating a repository of not only tips of what to do, but the stories that people are sharing while they are talking about techniques. I love to hear about what you think your work has been doing and its impact.
I thank you so much for that because I think the thing people ask, well, what are you most proud of? It's like, I'm most proud of the archive. I think having an archive, a repository of Black women's creativity in a variety of expressive forms, not just from the logistical instructive points. What to look for your first sewing machine. I have a whole episode on sewing ergonomics, like how to sit at the sewing machine, how to sew so your back doesn't hurt. Plus, talking to a student in her very first year at the Rhode Island School of Design, and then talking to that same student 4 years later as she's graduating and preparing both for New York and Paris Fashion Week. You know, talking with students from Parsons School of Design and from Virginia Commonwealth University Arts, talking with folks who are museum curators. I was able to interview a former Smithsonian curator who gave Faith Ringgold her first exhibition.
Wow.
Like, what? You know, I interviewed Bisa Butler, who I absolutely love and admire, for the 200th episode of the show. And it was fantastic. And so, what this is helping me to understand is that there are a variety of ways that the show, as well as the whole expansive field of possibility that Black women stitching represents. It represents self determination,
Mm,
it represents a type of bodily autonomy, especially for our plus size sisters who are sewing in an environment where the fashion industry is so toxic and hostile. It provides an outlet for creative expression that can be so personal and so private
mm,
because you're sewing by yourself at home. But then when you walk out into the world, you are outfitted. You know,
right.
for the longest time, I always make a first day of school outfit. I would do those for my family as well as for myself. And I very much imagine myself, as they say in the Bible, putting on the full armor of God, you know, like putting on clothing that gives you a chance to be in the world in a way that makes you feel whole, in a way that celebrates who you are, in an environment that would choose to diminish you. So it feels like in mindfully practicing the power of the stitch, it is more than just making a garment.
Mm,
It's making a statement. And that statement is both public as well as private. It becomes a site of just wonder and creative capacity. And
mm,
I think that liberation requires creativity. It requires you to look at a situation, a door that feels locked, and to say, there's got to be a window.
right.
There's got to be another way.
And that's part of our ancestral resiliency strategies and ingenuity in that regard. And that was necessary for our survival. I'm curious to hear from you too, right? Because we don't want to paint this as an experience that was just so easy. Like, I'm sure that there were challenges faced and opportunities that you encountered that helped you overcome them. So, what are some of the things that you've had to navigate through in this space, particularly since there was still that dominant cultural model around stitching and fabric arts as being a domestic art, or that it's primarily for or about white creatives. And then even for you to
Mm-hmm.
have this repository of a podcast that really highlights and amplifies these experiences, I'm sure you faced some of these challenges like, people, what are we talking about?
Yes, there were obstacles and there are obstacles. You know, I would tell people, oh, I have a podcast. It's about sewing. And they just be like, oh, who cares? You know, sewing. Also, trying to understand how an audio podcast about sewing could even work, that it would need to be video first. And I'm like, well, I'm not trying to teach everybody how to sew in every episode. I'm actually not doing a lot about teaching how to sew specifically. There is a lot in there, but that's not the primary mode. It really is about people that are already sewing and trying to bring more people into that community. One thing I really had to learn, the reason that I stuck with those people for so long was because I'm busy. I have another job. I would like to just sew, let alone creating an organization and a podcast about sewing. I just want to sew and leave. And it took me a very, very, very long time to accept that I would have to build what I needed because it was not there.
Mm.
I am not saying that I am the first organization to do this at all. I would never say anything like that. For me, creating Black Women Stitch as a space where we were deliberately out loud Black and not people of color in general, but that where Blackness kind of was the center and the core. I think that that might have been challenging for some people, but my biggest obstacle, Lisa, was the biggest obstacle because Lisa had to understand and accept that one, this could work. Two, it deserved to work.
Mm.
And three, I had to get out of my own way. I was very much struggling with the third one. I was trying to figure out how to raise money to pay for these things that I was doing. How do I have some kind of financial foundation? Because I think podcasting can be very inexpensive, but it's not free. The things that I couldn't pay for were the things I learned to do, which is why I learned to do so much. I was really getting wrapped up around money. I was thinking this can't be a pure Black liberation, Black affirming project if there is money, because money and capitalism are dirty and bad. And the best way to do this is to somehow pay for things with smiles and vibes. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, but I ended up having a conversation with Roxane Gay. This was on the platform called Clubhouse many, many years ago. And I was explaining how I just felt so stuck and I wanted the org to grow. And then she said to me, there is no such thing as clean money.
Mm.
No such thing as clean money. And if you want this to thrive, you will need money and you need to get out of your own way.
Mm.
After that, I started listening to some books. I got a book that I really love by Rachel Rogers. The title was a little, it's called We Should All Be Millionaires, which at first I thought was quite off putting. But then when I listened to the book, it's really amazing. And it really is very much like, why do we imagine that these white male billionaires that are destroying the planet somehow deserve all the wealth that they have and never have to show any work for it or any receipts or any proof of verification or validity? But we are meant to struggle and suffer in silence and be half equipped for the things that we want and to make do with less and to struggle, 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 struggle. That really shifted for me. And it helped me to see, you know what? I want this to thrive. I want to move in a way that this can be possible. So that's when I started applying for larger grants. I connected with our local community foundation, which has been a great supporter of Black Women Stitch and helped us. We have a fiscal sponsor that we acquired. And so we really have been growing. And now we're thinking about scaling and we're working on a strategic plan and, things like that. I've been invited to dream. And I think that dreaming really costs nothing. And I would advise everyone to remember that you have the right to dream and that part of Black liberation is the dream. Oh, I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. I would never say that. I would never want to step into the feet of my ancestors. I do not know what it was like for my Nana, who was born in 1913, the same year Harriet Tubman died, who lived in an environment where she didn't see a car until she was like 19 years old. Lived in a very rural environment and wasn't able to get all the privileges and benefits that her own daughter would one day have, and that my mother couldn't, imagine things that I currently have. It feels like we owe it to all the incarnations of our past selves and of our history to live as well as we possibly can in an environment that is still trying to destroy us. It did not destroy them, and it will not destroy us. Our ancestors thrived in environments that were so much worse than what we currently have. And that my responsibility is to do whatever I can to raise my own children to be free and to spread the message of our inherent right to liberation. I think a lot about the quote from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and she says, freedom isn't a secret, it is a practice.
Mm.
And I used that one year for our Juneteenth campaign back in 2021. I asked Alexis if we could use the quote, and then I made some art around it, and it was just so amazing. That practice is something we have to do every day. So it's in the reading practice, it's in your teaching practice, it's in your podcasting, it's in my stitching. Freedom isn't a secret, it is a practice, and we have to practice it every day, every second.
Act 3, Where We Land. Lisa, you have dropped gems throughout our conversation today, and I'm curious to continue to learn more about your hopes and dreams for Stitch Please, Black Women Stitch, and just the broader movement of Black creativity and craft going forward. Where can people find you? Are there things, events, showcases that are coming up that folks can tap into, follow along, learn, support? We'd love for you to share at this juncture.
Thank you so much again for this kind invitation. Thank you for sharing your platform with me, and to your listeners for listening. You have created something so beautiful, powerful, and meaningful, and I am honored to be a part of it. For Black Women Stitch, we are thinking very hard and working with a strategic plan for growth. There's lots of great ways to keep up with us. I think the first one would be joining the Black Women Stitch Patreon. We have quite a few different levels, but one of the things that Patreon folks get is videos of the episodes that we have. There is a lot of content currently in the Patreon. And most recently, I did what we called 12 days of Patreon, and there was 12 bonus gifts that will absolutely help you, as we say, get your stitch together. An interactive fabric guide, so you can learn the difference between what a knit fabric and a woven fabric, between scuba and neoprene, between rayon and silk, for example. There's this lovely little booklet. It's a little swatch booklet where you can print and fold, and you can put your swatches in it when you travel or when you're building out a project. There's things like how to get the pattern back in the envelope, a video about that. There's videos, there's printables, there's playlists, all kinds of fun stuff that are available right now in the Black Women Stitch Patreon. We have an Act Blue fundraiser as well that we kind of perpetually keep open, because donations are always very much appreciated. So they can find us at actblue.com/blackwomenstitch. And we have a newsletter. So if a donation isn't something that you're able to do at this time, please join the Black Women Stitch newsletter, and you can follow along that way. And Patreon also has some free tiers as well. So we are also pretty active on the socials. You can find us most often on Instagram, but we also post to TikTok, Facebook, and Threads as well. Find us and keep up with us and find out what we're doing, as I say, behind the scenes of Black Women Stitch.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing your journey, your vision, your heart with us. I'm deeply honored to have had this conversation with you, inspired and empowered, and reminded of how creativity and legacy and radical belonging are actually stitched into our lives. So thank you so much for joining us on Belonging to Blackness.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and be sure to subscribe. Find us on my website, www.indialoricwilmot.com. Follow us on IG and Facebook at belongingtoblackness_podcast for the latest fashion and accessories. Visit www.shopbelongingtoblackness.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.